Alright everyone, it's time for Vermont Issues Episode 9. Looks are deceiving, our forests only look old. A little bit about Vermont history here for people who don't understand it because they come from some urban area as a tourist. And they wander around in the woods here and they think, oh, these must be like centuries old or something like that. There are actually very few trees in the entire state of Vermont, or indeed in northern New England, that are more than about a century old. Here's a little bit of backstory. Over 100 years ago, back when there was still industry within the state of Vermont, a large proportion of our state, more than 90% of it, was completely deforested. It was lumbered off. We had a lot of lumber and textile mills and need wood, fuel the fires, build homes, sell the wood, and also to clear land because originally Vermont looked a little bit like rural England for some time. And it was realized, hey, if we clear off these forests, we can make a profit on the lumber. We can have mills and so forth. That makes jobs, that makes people's lives easier. Once it's all lumbered, though, and there are actually quite a few tree stump walls still remaining in the state in various places around some farms, then we can farm the land, we can grow crops, number one. But number two, of big importance with the textile industry in this state were sheep. That was a lot of people had a great deal of wool output at the time. Now, over time, industry moved in the United States. Originally, it made sense because you could float that shit down the river to the coast and sell in Boston or whatever. If you were doing it overseas, or certainly to the surrounding regions, the mills would make the textiles and then they were shipped all around what was then the United States, which was somewhat smaller and more sparse, with a population much more concentrated on the East Coast than it is now. Of course, now both coasts are heavily populated, certainly the Lakes region, parts of the Deep South, and so forth. It's a little bit different. The demographics have shifted over time. The population centers have shifted over time. That industry then began to dry up over time as demand was decreased by foreign textiles. Then people began to raise cows. And they're like, oh, we'll make milk and beef and things like that. What then ended up happening not many decades later is that mostly dries up too, turns into a cottage industry, really as beef begins being produced more in Texas, some of the more open lands in the Midwest and so forth, certainly far west. Even, again, parts of the South, areas that are more flat, they're more conducive to that style of pastoralism. And so Vermont's sort of beef and leather and milk industry begins to decline. What happened at that time is that Vermont rebranded itself largely as a tourist enclave. People got it in their heads, well, instead of looking like all of these other, heavily settled parts of the world, let the great forests roar back to life. And as the population growth began to stall out, we're talking post-Roaring 20s. The 20s were sort of the peak of Vermont industry. You get a lot of marble, a lot of stone of various kinds, and some of these latter-day textiles along with the leather and so forth. We shift away from that sort of economy. Small farming comes back in the Great Depression. You get some of the light machining industry later on. And then you have modern Vermont today, which is, there isn't much industry, honestly, in the state. We've got fewer and fewer local farms now, too. We're essentially now Switzerland. We're completely reliant upon tourist revenue, skiing, people's recreation from out of state largely. In-staters can't really afford the ski passes easily because most of them are kept impoverished by our socialist government here in this state. But yeah, the forests start to regrow because you're not grazing the cattle there. You're not grazing the sheep. You're not farming it. Certainly at some of the higher elevations that you can do grazing at, you can't even raise many of the crops. What are you going to raise? A bunch of cabbages, maybe. Not exactly a cash crop. It's not corn. It's not a sorghum or wheat or something like that. You're talking about things that are a little bit different. And so a lot of these forests come back, but almost none of these patches of forest began to regrow until the era of the 20s of the Great Depression. Most of these forests are less than 100 years old, and since then there's been controlled cutting anyway, in order to prop up a localized lumber industry, as well as to prevent, this is why our forests, like our deer herd, is so healthy, because the forests are relatively new. There isn't all that old growth, which is actually less biologically productive. Now, in one sense, that's great because they're working forests. You can periodically lumber off the older trees, let the newer trees grow, keep it sort of regenerating continuously. You can actually use it as a carbon sink in this manner, using certain methods, biochar certainly one of them. And it helps these forests to be more vibrant, less fire prone, you've got less of the old brush and so forth. And the shape and nature of our forests is nothing like it was before it was all lumbered off at the end of the 1800s in the first place for that textile industry. So when tourists come here and see the giant trees and it's so wild and wow, it's like stepping back into the 1700s or something. No, if you had gone back then, before all those areas were clear cut, when there were still just some patches of farmland and little towns, it would have looked totally different. It would have looked very old growth, like parts of the untouched Carpathian forest or something like that. It would have been totally different. It also would have had less wildlife in it. We've got a shit ton of wildlife in the state because we've kept those forests productive. At the same time, though, there are a few trees here and there that predate that period. Trees that were planted by people, in the mid-1800s in some cases. There are a few of them in Rutland. There are certainly some around the Woodstock area that I'm familiar with. You won't see hardly any of them in, like, Burlington. They're all fairly new growth. Comparatively, some of them are still old. They're almost a century old, but that's relatively new on the forest timeline. They're not exactly 300-400-year-old trees that you're looking at. They don't predate settlement. They have nothing to do with, Johnny Appleseed planted this tree, a long time ago. No, he didn't. No, nobody planted any of those trees back then. There's one really old twisted oak that I know of in Rutland, sort of up past the downtown, literally right on the main road. And it's enormous. It doesn't look anything like most of the trees in the state. I believe that's one of the very, very old pre-mid-1800s trees that still exists in this state. There are very, very few of them. Also, we've had diseases destroy some of the older plantings, like the Dutch elm disease that came into the state. Butternuts, they get diseased quite frequently. Although some of the trees, for some reason, don't show any symptoms. We tried to plant a butternut here, and it succumbed. It died. And that's really the way that our forests work. When you wonder why there are all sorts of cute little creepy animals, like, look at all the squirrels, look at all the pretty deer and stuff, and they're all healthy. Part of that's due to hunting and conserving our forests, selectively logging off old growth, dead trees, removing some debris, controlled burns at times, and so forth. Some of it's because of managing our herds within the state, literally by hunting them. There are some people, I can remember years and years ago, the state of Connecticut banned deer hunting, and they had a massive deer population explosion, and areas like even the suburbs were overrun with white-tailed deer. And they started to get sick because there were too many of them, and they said, oh, well, why is this happening? We're trying to be kind to the animals. It's because they don't have natural predators. You killed them all off. There aren't a bunch of wolves and cougars running around in your state, and nobody else is taking care of their density, and so they're simply going out of control, and they start raiding people's gardens and attacking their little fruit trees and stuff. People get pissed. Then they bring back deer hunting, and the problem is suddenly solved. All of a sudden, they're not sick and emaciated anymore because there aren't too many of them. That's actually to the benefit of this state that they have come to this understanding. It's part of the more rural, even pro-gun culture, I think, on that end. As far as the trees themselves go, they lend themselves really well to having these thriving populations of animals, as opposed to old growth, which stagnates a bit. One problem that we do have is a lot of people planted a bunch of pine trees many years ago, and so there are large areas of what would have been largely homogenized deciduous forest that instead are largely pine. I think some people have suggested trying to take care of this problem. It would be nice to have more deciduous growth in the state, if only for potential future agricultural purposes and lumbering. But it's more attractive, it's more biologically active generally. A lot of species, they won't eat a pine tree. I wonder why. Could it be because it sucks? You'd have to be a pretty dumb species to think that was a yummy meal, unless you bring back woolly mammoths. By the way, if they do clone woolly mammoths, bring some to our state. That'd be funny. Trust me, it's still cold enough for them to survive here. Trust me, they'll have no problem finding conifers to munch on, or anything else. I'd love to see a woolly mammoth. I think it'd be a great idea. Just make sure to make more than one or they'll get lonely. That'd be too sad if you just made one. Make like a dozen of them at a time. Tweak their genetics so they're not all inbred and stuff. Bring some to the state of Vermont, put the rest in like northern Canada, Siberia, wherever. It could work. Yeah, it'd be pretty cool. Get some megafauna going. Get the clone a giant sloth too while you're at it. That'd be funny. I'd love to see like a 15-foot long sloth lumbering through the woods. Very, very slowly. It wouldn't be much of a threat to humans unless it decides to get a tasty meal in your garage. It'd be like a bear on steroids, I guess. But yeah, I know I've gotten off on a tangent, but it's still pretty funny to talk about these things. That yes, to all the tourists, most of our forests are not many, many centuries old. There are a few little patches of kind of virgin forest left, or that were planted very early on and haven't been lumbered afterwards. But not even that is a fair rarity. That's about all. Peace out.